Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. This is Chris Judson and Remy. Thank you for joining us today. We will discuss how economic impact analysis equips the utility industry. Patrick Kelly, Director of Economic Development at FirstEnergy, and Jim Robey, Ph.D., Principal at Robey Analytics, are our guest speakers today. During this presentation, Mr. Kelly will provide an overview of FirstEnergy's strategic initiatives to build resilient utility systems, create 21st century jobs, and develop clean energy sources. Dr. Robey will continue the discussion by examining a compilation of studies emphasizing how large utility companies and approaching analytics, including using impact models that Robey Analytics has produced on behalf of FirstEnergy. Dr. Robey serves as a principal of Robey Analytics, a professional consulting firm specializing in economic development, workforce development, and site selection services. Jim is an applied economist, economic developer, and site selection consultant with over 30 years of experience. He has worked with corporate, nonprofit, and economic workforce development organizations. Jim previously served as the Director of Regional Economic Planning Services at the W.E. Upjohn Institute. His expertise includes industry studies, applied occupational analysis, economic impact analysis, modeling, economic and workforce development research analysis, and site selection assistance. Patrick is the Director of FirstEnergy's Economic Development and leads the development activity across the company's Ohio, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, West Virginia, and Maryland service territory. FirstEnergy's 10 regulated distribution companies form one of the nation's largest investor-owned electric systems, serving over 6 million customers. FirstEnergy has a long-standing history of contributing to the growth and vitality of communities and are privileged to serve through leadership and economic development. Site Selection and Business Facility magazines have recognized FirstEnergy as a top utility. Patrick serves on the boards of Bright Energy Investors, the Downtown Akron Partnership, Fund for Economic Future, Utility Economic Development Association, the Northern Ohio District Export Council. It has been a true honor of mine to work with both Jim and Pat over these years, and I'm excited to be a part of this presentation today. If anyone has any questions or comments, please submit them through the questions window, and we will be sure to answer them at the conclusion of this presentation. Thank you. With that being said, I will turn the floor over to Jim and Pat.
Well, thank you. And Jim, I think I get to go first, but this is a real pleasure. Not only are you both colleagues, but I consider you both friends, and it's a pleasure to be sharing the computer screen with you both. So a little bit about FirstEnergy. Chris mentioned it already, but I'll go through quickly, and Jim will continue to push me through the slides. We are located in the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic parts, the south parts of the country, and a corridor that really, as you can see from this map, right outside of New York City, in that corridor in between New York and Chicago, and we're in close proximity just outside of Washington, D.C. as well. So in a major area within the United States, we have over 6 million meters that we serve, which makes us one of the largest utilities in the United States. Over 12,000 co-workers, $45 billion in assets, and 65,000 square foot service territory that keeps us busy. And we've got enough wires, I think, to go around the equator. I don't know what the number was, like 6 times. So lots and lots of infrastructure. Jim, next slide. So here's a little bit better map of that. So 6 million meters, but there's about almost 18 million people in our service territory, and a very, very large labor force and lots and lots of different industries. And so we'll touch a little bit about each and every one of those quickly. So Jim, next slide. Shale gas is a big part of it, and probably one of our largest growth engines. So we sit right on top of the Marcellus and Utica shale. And not only is it a fuel and energy source, but certainly a building block in the chemical and plastics industries. A lot of those plastics go in the automotive industry. So we are just south of Jim in Ohio along that interstate alley of I-75, which is the auto alley where most of the automobile OEMs and tier one suppliers are located in the United States. So automotive is a big piece. Chemical industry, whether it's chemicals coming from the shale industry and gas, or certainly used for higher end pieces that we see in the biopharma industry, that's particularly prevalent in New Jersey, the medicine cabinet of the world, and in our service territory in Maryland. Data centers continue to be very, very important. Again, we're just right outside of New York City, so what's happening on Wall Street, and we're just on the other side of the Potomac River from Ashburn, Virginia, which is where the data center alley is, and we're seeing some of the activity spill over into our service territory as well. And about the biggest thing we do is we produce a lot of metal, and we bend it and shape it and do it in a lot of different ways too. So lots of metal producing and fabricating. Jim, next slide. This gives you kind of a quick overview of those 4 of those industries, and we got another slide that shows 6, but you can see where some of these concentrations are happening. Again, that automobile, chemical, shale gas, and data center. And Jim, one other slide. Looking at those metal producers and where they're located. And again, some of our consumer products in the rubber piece. So our headquarters are in Akron, Ohio, which is known as the rubber capital of the world, but has the highest concentration of polymer companies anywhere in the world. And not only in Akron, but all throughout Northeast Ohio, and then up into our service territory in Western Pennsylvania. And then we've got a lot of the producers that come in from the West Virginia area in terms of the chemicals and the production of the resins. And we are right outside. We will not serve, but the new, I think it's up to $8 billion now for a new ethane cracker that Shell is building in Southwest Pennsylvania. So again, big industry for us. Next slide, Jim. We think all these things are really important. So reliability, that's what our customers look at, and making certain we provide reliable power. We've got lots. We're used to serving these large industries, so that's very, very important. But as Chris had mentioned too, that mix is changing. So spending a lot of time understanding how and we can advocate and move towards a cleaner grid. Green by wire is one piece that we often talk about. And how do we continue to improve the reliability of our system as new things come through and ESG initiatives are big, and as we move towards, really a huge reduction by 2050 in terms of carbon-free generation. Skilled labor force can't do that. We've got probably more, I can't think of, maybe Massachusetts has more universities, Chris, they're certainly plenty up there, but we've got from Penn State to Princeton to Ohio State to University of Toledo to Kent State and others are right in our footprint that continue to fuel and bring out a skilled labor force. And business friendly, we're out there to try to make certain that we like business, we like big manufacturers, we like people that bring in employment. So, and our cost of living is very, very cheap, but it's a great quality of life. So Major League, Cleveland's going to be hosting the All-Star game this weekend, but we've got major sports teams and major cultural institutions throughout our service territory, and some great state parks and federal parks. Like come to Gettysburg or come to Antietam if you like things around Civil War history. We've got it all within our 5-state footprint. Next slide, Jim. And we do a lot in our economic development group. So we work with companies all the time and work with them on site location assistance to try to find the right spot for them, not only for our infrastructure and making certain as we continue to see more and more energy intensive industries, whether that's from data centers to distribution centers. For example, our service territory in the eastern part on the I-78 and I-81 corridor is the highest concentration of distribution centers, but going in there, many of them are now putting refrigeration, and certainly we're seeing a huge uptick on EVs. So how do we help electrify some of their fleets as well? So when we're helping them find the right site, and then we're working with them to make certain that they use and have a customized energy plan, and that we are trusted energy advisors. To do that, though, we need to continue to invest in our system. So we continue to do it at a $5 billion pace in terms of adding new transmission to our system to power not only these new things around electrification, but again, to help integrate the new renewables into our system. Next slide, Jim. So this is the part that I really wanted to talk about. You know, our mission is we are forward-thinking electric utilities centered on integrity, powered by a diverse team of employees, committed to making customers' lives brighter, the environment better, and our community stronger. And that's the piece I really wanted to talk about. You know, we're not selling electrons, we're selling our service territory. We're selling these communities that we serve. And they need a lot of information, and anything that you do in terms of economic development is really about making a strong business case. And to make a strong business case, you need data. And with that data comes a lot of requests for us to help. And so this is where Chris and Jim come in. And we work a lot with Remy, and we get a lot of very interesting questions. And Jim's going to talk about some of those. But we need to find ways to help answer those questions. And they're not usually simple questions, are they, Jim? And so we needed a model that puts something that actually helps us look at some of those. And that's why the Remy model is so important to us and why we invest in it. And we have our own model for our system with lots of different pieces, so we can look and dive down and understand different areas within our service territory as well, which is very diverse. We love the dynamic ability of Remy to look at things not in a static way, but look at these very complicated questions to answer that. We like that it's customized to our service territory, so we can get and understand and know that West Virginia is different than New Jersey, and Western Ohio is different than Maryland. We like the ability that it looks into the future as well as look at what's happening in the current pace. We'll often do shocks into our system to say, hey, for example, what does 100 new jobs mean in this area, to help our partners understand what's moving forward. And Jim is truly a thought leader in this. And so as our consultant that runs the program, we really think highly of what he does, and we very much value our collaboration. And one last piece. So this is nice that we help the community, but Remy, we have to make our own investments to help strengthen those communities as well. So we often look at different investments that we're making through the lens of Remy to understand what that means, and hopefully then explain to the community that this is why we're making this investment. We're good shepherds of our dollars, so we want our stakeholders to understand why we're making these investments, and we want them to feel comfortable and understand that many of these investments help improve the reliability of our system, but also the economic viability and competitiveness of their communities. Jim, I think that takes me over to you.
Excellent. A great introduction, Pat, and it's wonderful to have partners both at FirstEnergy and Remy. We really value both the entities. To continue on with what Pat was saying, why is Remy my choice of models, and maybe the fact that I've used it for 25 or 26 years might have something to do with it. But very early on, the analytics of Remy compared to other models like Implan, RIMS, and now EMSI, really just a much more, as Pat said, a much more dynamic model. It's better for doing long run analysis. It's interesting and capable of doing more than just changing jobs or changing investment, but also looking at changes in productivity and other things. And while I may sound like a salesperson for Remy, I'm not. I'm just an advocate for the model because I just think it does the best job. I think what Remy does better than most are its the ability to easily be multi-region configured and to use those regions very easily and in combined data, particularly for a client like FirstEnergy that operates, as you saw in the maps, across 5 different states, understanding impacts to their footprint. And I'll speak about this in a moment, but shocking 2 different regions, but being able to consolidate the regions into a single set of outputs is amazingly easy. In fact, sometimes so easy that it scares me that people may use the model without really thinking about the economics behind it. Another thing that I really like about it is many models, you know, RIMS and others, are relatively static I/O models. Remy works with our good friends at University of Michigan. I think some of you may have heard Don Grimes speak at a webinar yesterday on forecasting. But they provide some short-run forecasts. BLS provides some longer-run forecasts, and CBO the Congressional Budget Office. They integrate forecasts from those folks into this, and Chris can speak better to this than I can. The reality is, through this last 2 years of evolving economic conditions, changes in forecasts, understandings of differences in expectations for employment, GDP, and other things, Remy was regularly updating this to the point that we often talked about it is in an evolutionary standpoint in giving outlook talks. So that's one thing I really like about it. Again, it's a dynamic model, and so there are trade flows and economic geography concepts involved that make it more dynamic and helpful as prices change in places, as workforce changes in places. It, I think, gives a more realistic expectation of the markets. It's really good at doing time series. I know in some of our annual users meetings, people are looking out, into what, 2060, Chris, and that's, that's scary to me because, I'm not sure what I think is going to happen next summer, but it does give a good event horizon, particularly for federal projects and for the type of things that we do for FirstEnergy. And, again, I'm not here to sell Remy, but people like Chris and other long-run relationships, that quality of support and consulting, because in fact, I'm not an expert in any of these things that we're going to talk about. It's really working with the Remy people to understand from their experience it's the best model on behalf of FirstEnergy. And so utility applications for economic analysis. Chris, I think this might be, is this yours?
Yes, I wanted to add this just to expand the horizon for the viewers in terms of thinking of the potential applications for Remy. And so all of these, to one extent or another has been covered. I think, FirstEnergy does comprehensive work with Remy and Jim Robey and their partners on economic development. I think it's been applied for other things, looking at generation investments. We've done extensive work on dealing with transmissions. Of course, a growing discussion today is looking at fuel substitution, whether it be like away from nuclear energy into alternative types, and looking at the pros and cons of that, and really analyzing these changes over time. And that's what's so important about a dynamic model, that you can capture like these price effects and how that impacts like business competitiveness and consumer responses. And a growing area of interest is dealing with, of course, grid reliability and resiliency, but also looking at potential scarcities of resources, getting into like water utility investments and other policies and what that may mean. So it certainly is an exciting time looking at how this industry continues to transform. And with that being said, Jim, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. And so in thinking about the FirstEnergy Remy model, I was at a large chamber of commerce and took the model with me to a regional economic development organization in Northeast Ohio, TNEO, now part of Jobs Ohio. When I left, we were able to bring this model with FirstEnergy funding to a wider range of uses. Due to some needs over time, FirstEnergy's made additional investment in the model, and it's now a 13-region model. And one of the things that I like about this is that in working with Fred, Billy, Chris, and the others at Remy, as needed, we can find ways to reconfigure the model to meet a question in New Jersey versus Ohio, and those sorts of things. So it's a great team to work with. In some cases, in one of the current models we have now, we do rest of the United States because investments in other places often affect the footprint of FirstEnergy. And as I mentioned, the configuration varies based on timing. At any given time, we may be asking different questions in different places. You saw the things that Chris was talking about, and those come up as part of our conversations with Pat, his team, and leadership. And again, we have more than 25 years of experience in doing this. So what I'll do is very quickly go through 8 uses that we do with FirstEnergy using Remy for our internal uses. So it's important stuff, as Pat mentioned, to making their decision process, but also they provide our services often on a pro bono basis, using the model to work with partners to help them understand economic impacts and opportunities and other things. The first thing that we did, as Pat mentioned, their headquarters in Akron, Ohio, and everybody's always challenged about location decisions. And so Pat came to me and said, what do you think the economic impact of a headquarters location is? And so we spent some time talking about the establishment of the headquarters. Even though it's downtown, every headquarters can be different. One headquarters may truly be a NAICS 55 organization, but FirstEnergy also has lawyers and accountants and marketing and other creatives. And you really need to disaggregate that so you can better identify the functionality of a headquarters. So rather than just modeling all the jobs as NAICS 55, we ended up really parsing them out into the functions of the company and really looking at that supply chain that supports each of those and the households and other things. That's the determining the functionality of the site. We broke down the internal functions. One thing that I think Remy is particularly good at is making wage bill adjustments. And so as you have people maybe that are paid more, particularly in this current environment, as we've seen wage push inflation happening, we're able to more easily manipulate that. And so again, looking at this functionality of the site really affects the supply chain. And the unit of analysis matters, whether you're trying to shock a city, and we've in the past had a Cleveland-based model, whether you're shocking a county, a region, or in that region may be a collection of counties, it could be multi-state. And I think Remy's particularly good at working with those sorts of things, again, flexing back to that trade flow and price models and other things. One thing that Pat talked about is they're doing $5 billion worth of investment. And one thing that they asked about was if we do in state A, some investment in what you're seeing in towers and in reliability and resiliency, what's the what's the investment, the impact from investment over that event horizon? And it's really important to think about how that investment breaks down and how you put it in the model, because oftentimes it's as much art as it is science on how you may be shocking something like detailed industry sales. And so really working with Pat and team and supply chain, you really thought about those sorts of things. So rather than just say, okay, this is just utilities construction, we really broke it down into labor and wages, materials and supply chain. And really the thing that makes this a little bit different, and it's often confusing from people who use more simplistic models, I'm sorry to say, like Implan, where there's this just real clear direct input, indirect, and induced effects. We often move things out of the indirect area and put it directly into the directs. And so we have to talk about it differently, and we have to educate electeds, appointed, and staffers in a different way about this. And then it's always important, particularly when you're talking about that last group I mentioned, about are dollars estimated in nominal or real? And most of the time people are thinking in nominal dollars, but as economists, we think in real dollars. And so thinking about how you give outputs is really important. And then, the other thing is, how detailed is the pro forma? And everybody wants the biggest economic impact, but that's not what I'm here to do. What we're here to do is give the most reliable estimate. And the more detailed and the more reliable the pro forma that we might be basing this on will give better estimates, not necessarily bigger or smaller estimates, they're just better. And unit of analysis really does matter when we do this. If we're looking at a county, are we looking at a defined region, say an operating company? Are we looking at the impact to the entire state? Are we looking at a multi-state region? And so unit of analysis, when we think about these in configuring the 13 regions for FirstEnergy on an annual basis, and sometimes semi-annual basis, all of these things really do matter. One of the things that Pat talked about was comparing alternative sites. And as I mentioned, having that 13 regions, if we take the rest of the US out, but really just look at their operating footprint, we can shock very easily 100 jobs in a particular industry. Pat talked about many that they're working in to attract. We might shock one in Ohio and one in West Virginia. And look at the effect on the entire company. And based on distance decay and supply chains and workforce and cost and others, there could be different returns to the company across their entire footprint based on different locations. And so this becomes important when they're thinking about the investments that they're willing to make, and Pat can speak more to this in a moment. But when they're looking at how the returns to the company are, as he said, they have 6 million meters and they want to see those turn and how that affects them. In some cases, we have to use custom aggregations, and that allows us to ease the harvesting of output. And so we're able to combine everything into one, and it's an easy click. And that's one thing I really appreciate about Remy is its ability to change the output in ways that make life simple. So you're not trying to add up 13 regions, it does it for you. And again, place matters. Even close places are different. So if we look at the difference between Akron and Cleveland, Pat, 45 minutes away, but really the supply chains often become very neolocal. And impacts are very due to relatively local supply chains, distance of supply chains, and in many cases, regional economic conditions, tight labor markets, loose labor markets, high price labor, low price labor. The model is very sensitive to all of that. We talked about estimating the impacts from outside the operating footprint. So as Pat mentioned, across in Virginia, is the data warehouse alley. Well, when a lot of data warehouses go in there, what does that mean for population growth? And some of my good friends use the Remy model for demography. I'm not a demographer, but it really does create an opportunity to say, okay, even though this investment is outside of the footprint, what's the impact of the footprint? Because we know that economies are mobile and intra-regional. So that was the study that to estimate the impact of a company outside the region on the footprint. And you've got to configure the model in a right way. It may be like in Virginia that we have the 13th region configured for Virginia, or the rest of Virginia, or part of Maryland. So this is where the rest of region can be helpful, not only on the output side, but also on the input side. Like say you're trying to aggregate to the state of Ohio, the state of Pennsylvania, even though it's not FirstEnergy service delivery area, you have that region built into the model because it does aggregate to the state, but also things happening in non-parts of FirstEnergy space in Pennsylvania matter to the rest of Pennsylvania. And so we also do this with the rest of the United States. To veer off course for a minute, we did some work with the Manufacturing Extension Partnership in Alabama. It was interesting when you shocked Alabama and made their industries more efficient, how much impact it had across the rest of the country. I was really surprised by that. Again, using custom aggregations eased the harvesting of output. And again, place matters. To be redundant again and again, Remy uses trade flows and prices to do dynamic modeling, which is much more robust and I believe much more realistic than static I/O. And it is intertemporal, that those shocks that you do this year have an impact next year and the year after. So we also do a number of partner investments. We were asked to do a children's hospital, and the first thing that all of you are going to say is hospitals don't have an economic impact. The interesting thing about this project was, and we were able to partner with Sean Rowland at Kent State to do this, is they had really good data and they had some specializations that essentially people came from across the country to do. They had pediatric ophthalmological surgery. And so, it was really interesting, and they had a couple of really good data scientists. So we were able to parse out acuity because, in fact, children are not little adults. And so where they get their services were really important. And what it meant was that anybody that getting a lot of these services had to go out of market, and people in the region came into that market. And so it really was a but-for kind of thing. But for this facility, they would have been going to other major metro markets. Again, the staff there were data scientists on hand. They thought this was interesting. We looked at where patients came from, the type of services, acuity. And again, I mentioned Sean Rowland at Kent State. It was a really good partnership. Another thing that this is kind of a work in progress. If you're familiar, there's a lot of recreational assets in Northeast Ohio, particularly some near the headquarters location. And we were asked what the economic impact of expanding this facility was. And really what we came down to was it was really a complex question that we had to look at land use, we had to look at what development opportunities were, we had to see what the community would be working with, how this would impact the community, how demand would change, and how it could benefit local stakeholders. But we also had to think about important things like unit of analysis. Again, was this just that core county? Were we going to try and convince Remy to build a city model for us, which I know they never like to do, and I don't blame them. Or, you know, so where did we think people were coming from to spend this money? And so in some ways, this was a contribution analysis, that this would create more churn in the area and affect the nearby neighborhoods, which isn't technically an economic impact. But if we thought about this the right way, we could look at importing people in for recreational purposes based on forecast development. We're currently working on a project with Lourdes University. They're a small a private university outside of Toledo. FirstEnergy asked us to help them think through what their economic impact is. And so the first question is, does being private matter? I mentioned a moment ago the substitution effect for things, and that really is an important aspect, particularly for state universities, because if you don't go to Kent State, you might go to University of Toledo, Cleveland State, or as Pat misstated, the Ohio State University. Sorry, I'm just kidding. So we had to think about that, and then we had to look at the sources of revenues, how much was local commuting and other things, because ultimately dollars or jobs have to go into a model. And in this case, we decided that we would use the share of revenues that were not driven by the home base of a student, or at least those students that were from outside of the place driving expenses, because we needed to account for this substitution effect. Really important in any study you do is how good your data are. And this is where their CFO and staff were amazingly good and cooperative. And so the ability, as I mentioned, to reconfigure Remy based on need is a very important asset to us. So I want to talk about one last project, and then I'll turn it back over to Chris. We were asked to look at the impact of a consolidation plus new jobs in a food processing facility in Ohio. So we did have to kind of negate the impact of those jobs that already existed. And really, when we ran the pro forma on the operating side, and what you're seeing here is the build side to the project. And because of an NDA, I can't speak too much about it. But in this case, you know, there were new jobs, and it made the region more competitive. It was an export-based type of a thing. But using capital investments for this, we worked with FirstEnergy and Remy to do this. It created just the building of the facility, almost 3,900 jobs in the state. We had $282 million in GRP, $244 million in earnings, almost $500 million in additional output. And because of the ability to do, and I believe now, Chris, they're called favorites, they used to be called custom tables, you can configure output. And we used to pull about 400 pieces of data out of the model and put it into a spreadsheet model that would allow us to estimate. And in Michigan, we do have some places, but in Ohio, it's very prevalent to have a local wage tax. I believe everybody has one, but townships. And so we were able to estimate impacts to local wage taxes. We were able to estimate using kind of average marginal rates for state income tax. The CAT tax, if you're not familiar, is the commercial activity tax. It's a very low amount, but spread across a wide base of commercial activities. And so when you do transfers within the state, sales across a large number of NAICS industries, we're able to estimate that, and then we also estimate sales tax. But often what elected appointees and staffers want to think about is, so how does that affect employment? Because employment, creating jobs, at least until we got back to what is probably now near full employment, you know, people wanted to know, where are these jobs being created? So of those 3,800 jobs, 25 or 2,600 of them were in construction. And we sort of moved down here to the top of them, but it really does affect a whole bunch of folks when we do these sorts of things. And then I think the interesting thing to me, kind of doing some labor economics, is in the occupations and demand from the capital investment. And so while the other ones were really industry-based, these are understanding where you have to supply workers from and where you have to train workers to meet these demands. And had we more time, we would have gone into looking at the operations side of this, and these become particularly important from the supply chain standpoint, both for materials and goods and services, as well as people. And Chris, let me turn this back to you.
Great, thank you, Pat. Or thank you, Jim. This is actually another sample study of labor force training, utilities, state economic development organizations. In this case, this was completed by the Upjohn Institute through Jim Robey's leadership, looking at the economic impacts and manufacturing economic partnership as a part of NIST, the National Institute for Science and Technology. And they've continued to provide ongoing research on this. On their website, you can actually look at several years of these types of studies. And this one graphic I thought was a great illustrative narrative showing impacts on unemployment, gross domestic product, output or industry sales, personal income, returns to the Treasury. So that's the U.S. Treasury. So for every $1 invested in the program, you know, how many dollars do we estimate they receive in additional federal revenues? And then looking at the returns on investment. And Jim and Upjohn, they've done a great job of this. Jim mentioned accounting for, crowding out, substitution type effects. And so this follows a best practices approach that they have other economic development entities following now. So you can assume, well, what if everything is net new? And in this case, the unconstrained model. And then the constrained model, using a econometrically estimated approach, but essentially to look at, okay, well, you might be benefiting one firm, but it could be at a detriment to another. And so we have ways in which to do that. And then the third, this is looking at kind of a break even, right? So an optimization of at what level of new economic activity do we need for this program to break even? And amazingly, you know, even with accounting for crowding out, it only need about 11.5% of that for the program itself to break even. And we do see this time and time again, these occupational labor force type training programs and apprenticeship programs can have a great return. I think the key is, and I think both Jim and Pat can speak further on this, is, we've seen states where they say, okay, well, we want to be the next Silicon Valley, and they invest heavily in it. And that doesn't really materialize, or they provide these incentives for all these computer programmers and then they leave. So it's important to reach out to the communities, figure and look at the data, figure out the occupations that are in demand, where those skills gaps are, and I think that's a big part of this program. And Jim can speak better to this, but it was really dealing with that mid-skills gap that I believe continues to exist. But this program helps support shrinking that gap of either upskilling or retraining new staff and bringing on additional labor force into this field. Jim or Pat, do you have anything you wish to comment on in regards to labor force training?
No, good to go. Thanks.
No, but important research, and obviously workforce is the biggest issue we have. So another great example of Remy's capabilities.
Thank you, Pat. Jim, next slide.
Oh.
Yes, so this is a last example I'll show from Remy's side. Of course, additional studies, examples available upon request. So this is an energy efficiency program evaluation. Now, a lot of our utilities do this. I believe NYSERDA does this on a biannual basis. And so they look at the costs and benefits of all their energy efficiency programs. And so on the bottom part of that graph, the negative impacts, those are the associated costs, and then the positive impacts are associated with the benefits, right? So usually there is a lot of times, right, it's an impact on rates to account for LED lighting, cooling systems, insulation, new windows, things of that nature. But there are benefits, and so you can look at the payoff period, and you can compare it under multiple different scenarios. For example, like changes in natural gas prices and other energy prices, as that could certainly have an impact on your ROI. That does it for me, Jim.
So Chris, I guess we're ready to take any questions, but if I can take one moment to really wrap up, I think that again, without Fred paying me to say this, I think this is really a strong model, and I think that and hopefully FirstEnergy continues to find value not only internally but with their external partners, and so the ability of this model to support internal and external economic development activities and investment activities, I think is a great use of the model. So thanks, Chris and Pat, for the opportunity to present with y'all.
And I will say that life to me is very little black and white. Many of the questions that we ask have a lot of subtleties, have a lot of complexities to the work. And so, as Jim mentioned, what I love about the Remy model is it's almost much art as it is science, and it really allows us to dig deep and come up with the right answers to a lot of these complex questions that we look at on a regular basis.
Thank you, Jim and Pat, for the stellar presentation and continued, exemplary use of our models. So I do have a few questions here. Just before I read them off, I do want to remind the attendees today, please, if you do have any questions or comments, please submit them through the questions window. So firstly, and I think this goes to both Jim and Pat, have you seen changes in site selection preferences since COVID, given changes in labor market conditions and supply chain uncertainty?
Pat, that's you.
Well, I will tell you that I guess we were worried about just site selection happening at all. And I think if you talk to every utility practically and every economic development professional, we're all just trying to keep up. The level of activity has actually increased dramatically. I think we've seen some indication of some potential reshoring. I think the drive to find workers is certainly pushing things through. And I guess we've noticed that there's a lot more energy intensity to the projects than we've seen in recent years, particularly around data centers. But what's happened recently too is cryptocurrency continues to become more popular in the United States, and the work around Bitcoins and distributed ledgers and all the work that you see with cryptocurrency, it's certainly a trend. More work along data center operations as well. So we're seeing more and more of that work. I will tell you that from our 6 million economic indicators, we're seeing an increase in residential usage and a drop in some cases, especially early on in the pandemic. So we went up about 4% in residential usage and about a 2% drop in both commercial and industrial. We're seeing a pushback on the industrial side. And we're seeing still some weakness in the small business sector, as you might expect, and still trying to figure that out. We're working on trying to find some programs to help fill in some of those boarded up storerooms that we all see around too much in our neighborhoods, to get some of the small business and those entrepreneurs that operate them there. But I guess the biggest probably trend that we've seen, Chris, is more work from home activity.
Yeah, that is interesting to see a shift, more residential demand, less industrial commercial. Next question, how does the rise in EVs affect FirstEnergy opportunities and challenges?
Well, it's a great opportunity, Chris. It's a challenge to meet it. I mean, if you look at some of the numbers and see some of the work, and even like Princeton's done some really interesting work on trying to figure out what it would take to get to net zero by 2050. we are really trying to get out in front of what we think will be a wave of EV activity, not only just in our homes, and we think a lot about that, the 17 million or so vehicles that maybe it was less right this year, Jim, with the chip shortage that are happening, but some of the fleet vehicle electrification as well, especially for the shorter and midterm haul piece. And so trying to get out in front of that and seeing and working closely to figure out how we're going to manage through that. So we're spending a lot of time. We're part of a consortium of other utilities that are looking at how we make certain that we work with range anxiety and make sure there is enough charging units throughout our footprints to manage that, and people getting greater sense of security to understand that they can recharge. Understanding how that's going to be changing. A much stronger move to level 3, Chris, in terms of customers are used to going to a gas station and filling up their tank and continuing on. We were usually, most of everyone's commutes are relatively short, but when you're off to go see family in Georgia or Louisiana, as Jim's going to be doing, and you've got to make certain that you get the ability to have the infrastructure in place. So we're working with other utilities to do that as well. So it's certainly on the forefront. We're working with a lot of our larger companies to understand what their fleet needs are going to be, and trying to make certain that we are that trusted energy advisor to move forward. So it's clearly one of our bigger issues that we are working on right now to make certain. And honestly, we view this as a lot of things through the lens of affordability. So electrification, I own my own electric vehicle, and I fill up, probably for 40 gallons, or for what would be the equivalent of 40 miles or a gallon of gas for around $1.10 on an electric bill every month. So we think that also gives people the opportunity to take some of that money that they were spending on their transportation and use that elsewhere.
Oh, exciting. And from the manufacturing standpoint, I don't know if you guys encountered much in terms of the unique supply chain with electric vehicle and electric battery manufacturing with the Lordstown plant and other developments in Ohio.
Yes, and next door to that Lordstown plant, the former plant, is the Ultium project. It's a joint venture between LG Chem and General Motors, and a several $billion investment in building batteries and e-mobility. It's in the Mahoney Valley, but we're calling it the Voltage Valley now as we see that coming through, but lots of other activity as well. So vehicle electrification is certainly on the forefront of our activities with the automotive industry as well.
Yeah, truly exciting times. So in general,
we're getting a charge out of it.
Electrifying. Yeah. Jim, this next question is for you. How long does it typically take to perform an economic impact analysis?
That's a great question. An afternoon to 2 years. It really is. I mean, there's times that Pat will come to me and say, hey, back of the envelope, what's this look like? And I think Remy's really good at that, because when you've used it, you're kind of going back to Pat's comment, it's a bit of an art as much as science. So there's times that we do something very quickly. And other times I'm just finishing a study that I presented in the past on wind energy, and it was a stop and start, and getting to the data, it really is a range, kind of depending upon the level of accuracy that you want. Again, it doesn't make it bigger or smaller. It just better data, more detailed data, having a good client to talk through the data with, really takes time.
And for both of you, how receptive are policymakers to the impact results? Any recommendations on best practices when speaking to these types of impacts? And how would you speak to social equity and some of these other emerging issues?
You've hit on something. Again, as I mentioned, we're finishing up this wind study in Michigan, and getting in front of, and we've now expanded this. It used to be electeds and appointeds, but also staffers. You've got to get this in English. We can go talk, very high level and all that other stuff, but you've got to get it in English. You've got to explain your methodology. So you've got to be as bulletproof on the data, the methodology. Using Remy, again, maybe Fred, you do owe me a check. You know, it's a pretty bulletproof model. I mean, there's only a couple models. Everybody knows Remy. It's used at the federal level, the state level. Lots of regional organizations, COGS and others use it. So, you know, it's got credibility. And I think it's going in and talking to rather than down to people. You know, and Chris, you can speak to the SEI, and Pat, you can talk more to this also. But, you know, it really is, there's the ability to look at wage bands and other things and talk about occupations. We did some work in the arts in Cleveland, and, you know, outside of interpretive dance and jazz trombonists and stuff, there were lots of other occupations like, you know, truck drivers and plumbers and others. And so it's about explaining the portfolio of outcomes from shocking something.
And I think, Chris, it's playing a role in our environmental justice. So what does a new transmission line going through? Some people are like, oh gosh, why are you putting it through here? Well, there's an existing corridor. But look, it will also then, and I mentioned the energy intensity of some of our new projects, it could also then lend itself to being able to attract that type of investment into maybe an area that's not seen a lot of investment, and be able to bring jobs and create wealth in that community. So I think it helps, at least Remy, in terms of these environmental justice discussions, to have a more nuanced and broader understanding of what some of these potential investments may mean. And
in fact, let me add to something that Pat said that I think is really, really important, that we often think about, okay, this new plant meets the but-for economic development, but much utility investment is also a but-for these transmission lines, but for this power plant. These jobs would not have come here, and these new households would not have employment. So wages and sales and other things, supply chains, would not be happening. And so I think it's important to think about but for, even in the case of the Children's Hospital, but for the services they provided, these impacts would not have happened.
And that's why I put information is power. Anytime you're having social equity or environmental justice discussions, it's very, very important to be transparent and to have good information.
Well said. Thank you both for your expertise and time today. If anyone does wish to contact our presenters today, please do so. Or if you're having a hard time finding their contact information, please reach out to Remy, and we'll gladly put you in touch. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Hope you have a great rest of your day. A copy of this webinar will be made available within a few business days on our website. And we look forward to future collaboration. Thank you, Jim and Pat.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.